If we look to the entry on Confucius in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, quote, Confucius is arguably the most influential philosopher in human history. Is, because taking Chinese philosophy on its own terms, he is still very much alive, end quote. Confucius was born around the year 551 BC in the state of Lu during the spring and autumn period, a time of steady prolonged decline of the central authority in China. He became known as the most learned man of his time. We might compare him with the Greek philosophers who lived in the centuries immediately after his own. Confucius was a moralist in the style of Socrates. Both men came from humble beginnings, established themselves as teachers of philosophy, and emphasized virtue as their fundamental teaching. In fact, Chinese tradition holds that Confucius was the first man to devote his entire life to teaching. Confucius could also be compared with Socrates' student Plato. Confucius founded his own academy and gathered thousands of followers. Furthermore, pretty much all of Chinese philosophy is a footnote to Confucius, in the same way that Whitehead said all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. But, on the other hand, the Japanese writer Ryunosuke Akutagawa once referred to Confucius as China's Christ, because there is really no comparison between Confucius and other philosophers. Akutagawa's remark shouldn't be taken as a statement that Confucianism is somehow analogous to Christianity. Rather, it's a statement of just how profoundly China was shaped by the Confucian influence, how Confucianism has suffused almost every aspect of Chinese society for millennia, the same way that Christianity has in the West. Christianity runs so deep that often we're not even consciously aware of how our moral, political, and aesthetic judgments are derived from the Christian tradition. Confucianism is sometimes portrayed in the West as a restrictive social ideology that forces people into familial and class roles, demands utmost respect for the social hierarchy, and assigns duties to people according to their station in life. In a sense, this is true. Chinese society is based on hierarchical relationships. Confucian morality sanctions these relationships, and Confucian ritual is, in a way, a celebration of these relationships. But this picture is incomplete, and Western scholarship in recent years has brought out the nuances of Confucianism. For an example of this, I'd recommend Michael Puett's lecture on Confucianism entitled The Path. I've included a link in the video description. And in so many words, Puett describes how Confucian ritual often served the function of breaking up the monotony, the rigidity of these class relations and familial relations. But if you want to know more about this, I'd recommend checking out his talk. The 5 relations that govern Chinese society appear first in the Analects of Confucius and were later formalized by his successor Mencius. The relations are ruler and minister, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger sibling, and friend and friend. The pattern we might notice with all of these relations is that they almost all involve a superior and an inferior, and Confucius is often credited with this ordering of society, this structure in which some give orders and others obey them. But Confucius didn't invent the 5 relations out of thin air. It obviously wasn't Confucius's decision that we should have kings, or that fathers should have patriarchal control over their families. Confucius was giving names to what already existed, and in doing so, Confucius defines exactly what it is that constitutes the proper type of a given relationship. Much of Confucius's project involves itself with naming. Naming these relationships, naming the virtues, even naming the ideal for a human life, which, in the ethics of Confucius, is the superior person, or literally translated, the son of the ruler. In that literal meaning for the term superior person, son of the ruler, it already becomes apparent that Confucius is not just defining terms, but often redefining them. The son of the ruler, the superior man, is no longer simply the descendant of a certain bloodline, but a man who becomes superior through virtue. So, while at a first glance, Confucius is merely reifying the superiority of the king over his ministers, by laying out what is expected of both the ministers and the king himself, such that he defines the proper relationship between them, Confucius redefines what it means to be a king. For Confucius, the king is the central pillar of the country's virtue. In the Analects, he says, quote, "A ruler who governs his state by virtue is like the North Polar Star, which remains in its place while all the other stars revolve around it." End quote. If the king is unvirtuous, then the harmonious balance, this vast web of relations that constitutes society itself, will be thrown into disorder. If his kingdom falls, it will be the fault of the king himself for being a bad king, or we might even say, not truly being a king at all. And this was far from an obvious or universally held opinion when Confucius disseminated his teaching. The most famous opponents of this idea were the legalists, who attained prominence during the Qin dynasty, the first great empire of ancient China. They believed that rulership was not established by virtue but by force, and that the ruler shouldn't concern himself so much with cultivating personal virtue as with ensuring that he has a firm grip on the reins of state through his power to reward loyal and competent servants and punish disloyal and incompetent servants. It is far from obvious, at least in practice, that a king has to hold himself to a certain moral standard as a condition of being called king. And yet, Confucius's ideas exerted such incredible power over the collective psyche that the ruler came to be seen as responsible for basically everything that happened in society, good or bad, even when no human being could be blamed, and in fact, especially when no human being could be blamed. The classic and obvious example of this would be the flooding of the Yellow River, which was often so incredibly destructive that it boggles the minds of those of us who are used to reading Western history. The death tolls are always so incredibly high in comparison. We have to remember that the emperors ruled over a population of around 60 million people by the time of the Han Dynasty. The scale and complexity of the society required decisive rulership, which meant that the ruler had to be willing to take full responsibility for the state of that society. As the historian Ray Huang puts it, the very reason why the emperor was called the Son of Heaven is because, quote, "He was drafted to handle a situation in which, to put it analogously, the lower Mississippi could at any time change its course and run into the sea in Florida. A drought or locust pestilence could lay waste to the entire harvest of Kansas and Iowa. The semi-religious setting of the court at Xi'an strengthened the position of the emperor as the final authority on earth. His arbitration carried the force of divine judgment. From this practice emerges a tradition that in power politics, technical problems are treated as moral issues." End quote. You've probably heard of the concept of the mandate of heaven, which also features heavily in the work of Confucius, and this is deeply related to this issue of the morality of the ruler. This is effectively a metaphysical explanation for the legitimacy of the monarchy. The other side of that coin is that the mandate of heaven establishes a moral framework for understanding the successes and failures of the state, meaning that the monarchy can delegitimize itself through immorality or impiety. If a minister somewhere acts foolishly and leaves the gates open for the Xiongnu to invade, well, clearly that minister is to blame. But if the rivers are flooding, the people are starving, and it just seems like heaven itself has withdrawn its favor from the empire, well, the person to blame must be the moral center of society, the emperor himself. Now, don't misunderstand this. This doesn't mean that the ancient Chinese had an impeachment process similar to the one we have today in American democracy, where the ministers could get together and say, "You've lost the sanction of heaven, we're taking power away from you." Whenever that kind of thing happened, it happened violently in the form of civil war or assassination. But such developments in themselves, however, were seen as evidence of having lost the mandate. The belief in the mandate of heaven imposed a real concern for those who held the title of emperor not to lose it. Even the conception of the governing force of the world as heaven rather than a personal deity is also the work of Confucius. According to Wingsit Chan, quote, "Up to the time of Confucius, the supreme power was called Ti, the Lord, or Shang-Ti, the Lord on high, and was understood in an anthropomorphic sense. Confucius never spoke of Ti. Instead, he spoke of Tian, heaven." End quote. The students of Confucian philosophy aimed to live in accord with Tian Li, the principles or the laws that govern heaven, and therefore to follow the Tao, or the way of heaven. In other words, rather than one or many personified entities, the image of the divine that Confucius suggests is rather a moral order. The earthly political body ought to be a reflection of the divine moral body, and to the extent that an earthly political order adequately reflects the harmony and the virtue that governs heaven, that political order will succeed. But we must recognize this as another redefinition on the part of Confucius, who again is often portrayed as simply recapitulating to the social order as it already is, or establishing rigid, inflexible rules. But in practice, he's redefining the ways that we speak about the divine and how we understand ourselves in light of that new understanding. So, what exactly is going on here? Is there some other way that we can understand what Confucius is doing philosophically and why he's doing it? Hakamaya Noriaki is a critical Buddhist scholar who has an interesting comment on this dynamic. Critical Buddhism, as Hakamaya defines it, is the position that Buddhist thinking is critical and critical thinking is Buddhist. In other words, the way to think about Buddhism is that it criticizes conceptual notions upon which our common sense view of the world is based. For example, the idea of selfhood or thingness. For the Buddhist, there is no essential core to any phenomenon. If we think critically about all the objects and people and events that we experience, we'll find that every phenomenon is dependently arising, and therefore has no independent essence. This is just one example of critical thinking and Buddhist thinking going hand in hand for Hakamaya. If you want more examples, you should check out his work. But there have been a number of forms of critical philosophy throughout history that often come into conflict with pre-existing essentialist modes of thought. The critical Buddhists use the term topicalism to refer to any belief in some fundamental reality or unchanging essence. And they even claim that many schools of Buddhism should really be excluded from Buddhism, insofar as they adopt topicalist rather than critical stances. Perhaps the most ready-to-hand example would be the idea of Buddha nature in Zen Buddhism, the stance that every person is already originally enlightened. They have the Buddha as a part of their very nature, and all they have to do is awaken to it. This suggests that there is a reality, Buddha nature, that is somehow deeper or truer than the empty, dependently arising world that we experience. Hakamaya argues that this topicalist tendency was pre-existent in Chinese thought before Buddhism arrived. We can perceive it in the way that Lao Tzu talks about the concept of Tao as a universal principle according to which all things behave. In the Tao Te Ching, there's this concept of the hidden and the manifest, and one way of putting this might be that while 1,000 things manifest and change and fall away, the truth that is hidden from most, due to their intellectualizing and attachment to the many manifest things, is the Tao, the way that is eternal and thus cannot be spoken of. And, true enough, Zen Buddhism seems to have taken inspiration from Taoism as a formative influence. Both traditions talk all the time about change and relativity and the inadequacy of language, but ultimately posit an eternal, unchanging, universal principle of reality. In the case of Lao Tzu, it's the Tao, or in the case of the Zen Buddhists, it's the Buddha nature. Hakamaya writes that Confucius was different. Quote, like Shakyamuni Buddha in India, Confucius in China was a critical philosopher who took language from the indigenous Chinese and then critiqued that topos with the concept of propriety distilled into the language of human ethics. End quote. A topos is a traditional formula, and thus Hakamaya's argument is that Confucius, in a manner at least similar to the method of critical Buddhism, used the existing language in order to undermine the topicalism expressed in that language. We can find something similar in Western philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche argued that all languages are functionally essentialist, at least to some degree, and that the word concept itself presupposes a unity that is fundamentally erroneous. Much of Nietzsche's critique of language involves his attempts to show that words tyrannize over our thought by confounding unequal things. So that would be a Western critique of topicalism. Confucius's project, on the other hand, is called the Rectification of Names. You could say that in an ideal situation, names would correspond to actuality. Confucius can therefore be called critical, as Hakamaya asserts, insofar as he makes naming, language, one of his central concerns, and points out the difference, wherever he can find it, between the name and the actuality. For Confucius, the names we use can create order or they can create disorder. Whereas for the Taoists and Zen Buddhists, there's an essential principle which is actually beyond names and words, and oftentimes they argue that the names we use obscure that principle. One could certainly get the impression after reading a bunch of Zen koans that the words and names we use really don't matter. Oftentimes, when the masters are asked questions in these koans, they answer nonsensically. For example, when a monk asks the master Tozan, "What is the Buddha?" he answers, 3 pounds of flax. Now, people debate all the way up to the modern day what koans like this one mean, but it seems clear to me that when people have an enlightenment experience in these dialogues, it's due to an experience they're having, something which, according to the Zen tradition, is beyond words and letters. But the critical Buddhists would be the first to point out that our experiences themselves are empty and unsatisfactory and impermanent. For them, it's not about having some fleeting experience that you then cling onto as though you glimpsed some sort of eternal underlying truth. The point is about critically and empirically understanding and applying dependent origination on a day-to-day basis. Now, I know this is a lot about the critical Buddhists, and Hakamaya's position is controversial, and I wouldn't suggest that his interpretation of Buddhism should be taken as gospel. But we can glean some interesting insights about Confucius's project if we view it through this lens, Confucius as a critical philosopher. Consider this famous passage from the Analects. Quote, "Zhu Lu said, 'The ruler of Wei is waiting for you to serve in his administration. What will be your first measure?' Confucius said, 'It will certainly concern the rectification of names.' Zhu Lu said, 'Is that so? You are wide of the mark. Why should there be such a rectification?' Confucius said, 'How uncultivated you are. With regard to what he does not know, the superior man should maintain an attitude of reserve. If names are not rectified, then language will not be in accord with truth. If language is not in accord with truth, then things cannot be accomplished. If things cannot be accomplished, then ceremonies and music will not flourish. If ceremonies and music do not flourish, then punishment will not be just. If punishments are not just, then the people will not know how to move hand or foot. Therefore, the superior man will give only names that can be described in speech, and say only what can be carried out in practice. With regard to his speech, the superior man does not take it lightly." End quote. So, for language to be in accord with truth, the names have to be rectified. What does this mean? Confucius tells us, names must be able to be described in speech. We must be able to meaningfully say what a name means by reference to other things, and we should only say what can be carried out in practice. At a glance, it might be tempting to classify Confucius as a pragmatist then, but I think Confucius himself would say that's a rather inadequate name to describe him. Rather than emphasizing the practical outcome of the action over and above the words we use to describe it, Confucius is asserting the necessity of a unity between word and action, or word and deed. A modern reader might easily question whether failure to observe the ritual ceremonies will actually have a causal relationship with whether the punishments of the state are just. Really, you could question any of the causal relations that Confucius lays out here. But let's steelman his position. Fundamentally, he's saying that if our definitions of things don't correspond to actuality, if our actions negate the beliefs we claim to hold, if our ideas about human society can't be put into practice, then society will become disorganized and chaotic as a consequence. This could detract from society's abundance, and abundance is a precondition of ritual sacrifices and other such ceremonies. Remember, those ceremonies uphold and celebrate the relations of superiority on which the order of society is based. The mandate of heaven will be withdrawn, and people will act immorally, as they always do in a time of scarcity. And in the chaos, no one will know the proper course of action in a given moment. The people won't know how to move hand or foot. In other words, the entire foundation of human life is based on the rightness of the names we use. If we recall the 5 relations once again, and the striking claim that a king who fails to live up to his station is not really a king at all, Confucius makes this explicit in one of his dialogues. Quote, Duke Qing of Qi asked Confucius about government. Confucius replied, Let the ruler be a ruler, the minister be a minister, the father be a father, and the son be a son. The Duke said, Excellent. Indeed, when the ruler is not a ruler, the minister not a minister, the father not a father, and the son not a son, although I have all the grain, shall I ever get to eat it? End quote. So someone can be called a king and not be a king. The metaphor about grain at the end is apt. It's like speaking words that don't match your actions, or having wealth on paper that you can't actually use, or having food locked in a storehouse that, for whatever reason, you can't actually eat. This is why Hakamaya says that Confucius imposed propriety on the language, because Confucius demanded that every relation, every name, be proper. Further, one's own actions ought to be proper according to the name. Certain things are expected of you as a filial son, just as certain things are expected of your father. Zhu Xi, writing more than 1,500 years later in his commentaries on the Analects, argues that there is a reason why Confucius became concerned with the rectification of names after he came to Wei. The Duke was currently embroiled in a political struggle with his own father. When giving due honors to his ancestors, he skipped his father, honoring his grandfather instead. Quote, At that time, in the ancestral temple, Duke Chu of Wei did not acknowledge his father as his father, but rather acknowledged his grandfather as his father, throwing the correspondence between names and actuality into disorder. That is why Confucius wanted to first rectify the names. End quote. In other words, Confucius drew a direct link from the failure of the son to act as a proper son to this time of political turmoil in which father and son oppose one another. Interpreted in this way, Confucius is not a pragmatist, someone who believes there's no truth outside of what is practical, nor is he an essentialist who believes that truth corresponds to some fundamental reality beneath the relations. Language for Confucius does not express an essential truth, but a moral truth. And this is a very strange way of thinking about language, but it has a sense to it. Normally, we think about naming as the act of describing what is the case. But the thrust of Confucius's position is that names express what should be the case. We might compare this to the way Aristotle uses the term telos, or purpose. Contained in any definition is essentially a series of qualifications. The definition expresses the purpose of the thing defined, and is therefore an evaluative standard rather than a straightforward accounting of the facts. When we define something a certain way, whether it's the office of one of the king's ministers or a cup for offering ritual sacrifices, we're not just describing things as they are, but setting qualifications for what that thing should be in order to be named that. And indeed, in one of the passages in the Analects, Confucius inquires about using a ritual offering cup, a gu, that doesn't actually qualify as a gu. These ritual cups have a certain shape to them, there's certain qualifications for what can be called a gu. And so by analogy, we might imagine that we're going to serve champagne, and we have glasses to serve it in, but they're not champagne glasses. They don't have the stem or the long shape. Can we still call them champagne glasses? Can we? Well, I mean, it's really up to you. In the case of serving champagne, whether we call them champagne glasses or not may not seem to matter all that much. But this draws out the moral element in language that is key here. The more a given name matters, the more it really affects society, the more we ought to demand that the name match the actuality. The shape of ritual offering cups isn't a critical issue in modern-day America, for example, but it certainly was in the context of Chinese religion. And I would actually argue that even this kind of dispute isn't all that foreign to modern life. There's an anecdote in one of Dan Barker's books where he says that he knew of a church that split over whether the communion cup should have a handle or not. Religious disputes oftentimes involve the interpretations of the words used in the Holy Book and what is really demanded of the practitioner depending on how the word is understood, the moral implications of the definition. We might think of the passage in which Jesus describes how difficult it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. But what does it mean to be rich exactly? Well, the purveyors of the prosperity gospel here in America will certainly dispute with more traditional interpreters of that passage. Or we might think of Islamic societies today who have differing views on what constitutes a head covering for women, how much has to be covered, what qualifies as a head covering. And depending on their level of religiosity, Jews have different interpretations of what it means to work on the day of the Sabbath. Once you perceive this moral element that is contained in the definition, it becomes clear that so many of our interpretations of a word involve an implicit statement of how we should act. One example that could be helpful is found in the Xin Shu, a Confucian text by Jiang Lu from the 1st century BC. The text includes the following story. Quote, Confucius was sitting with Ji Sun, and the manager of Ji Sun's household sent a message saying, "The monarch is sending people to borrow horses. Should we lend them to him?" Confucius said, "When we hear that the monarch is asking his subject for things, we call it taking. We do not call it borrowing." Ji Sun understood what Confucius meant and told his manager, "From today on, when the monarch sends people for things, just say that he is taking. Do not say that he is borrowing." Confucius's correction of the word borrow determined the status of monarch and minister. End quote. Now, is the rectification that Confucius enacts in that passage an endorsement of the fact that the ruler can take whatever he wants from his subjects? Could it be read as an implicit criticism in pointing out the mismatch between, the more congenial idea of borrowing, the way one might borrow from a friend, and the reality of the monarch's action? Maybe in saying borrowing, we're masking what's really going on. Whatever opinion you come to, a prerequisite for forming an opinion is recognizing the actuality, using the name that actually corresponds to that actuality. The ruler takes, he doesn't borrow. He's not your friend, he's your superior. This helps us see with clear eyes what kinds of rights and responsibilities the ruler has and that we have, instead of obscuring that power with false names. The significance here, again from a Nietzschean perspective, is that these acts of naming represent a moral valuation from differing perspectives and are established on a relative basis, according to the way of life favored by the perspective in question. Nietzsche would also hold that there are some ways of valuing that are better than others. For Nietzsche, the evaluative standard could be called life, health, or power. Confucius also has such a standard, but his goal is harmony or order, which he believes will foster humanity itself. Therefore, we have to understand Confucius's claim to authority to say what is actual and what isn't, as based on the fact that he is the kind of person, a superior person, who can tell the difference between order and disorder. Hans-Georg Moeller over at the channel Carefree Wandering, which everyone should go check out for a much better explication of Eastern philosophy than anything I could manage. Moeller has argued that this was the job description of the philosopher in China, rather than the view which is more common in the West, that the philosopher distinguishes truth from appearance. That being said, Confucius is certainly not a relativist thinker, and I don't want to give you that impression. He would probably have very little tolerance for Nietzsche's thinking in that regard. Like Socrates, he has faith in the power of learning to lead people to virtue. In other words, if you become educated, then you can see clearly, as Confucius does, which names are proper, which names are fostering order, and which names need to be rectified. The superior man, as Confucius conceives of him, is not a person of the Nietzschean master morality, but rather can be any person at any level of society, so long as he understands the necessity of the interrelationships that preserve order and acts accordingly, depending on his station in society. Of course, the eternal problem is that it's not entirely clear that people can be instructed to become virtuous. Confucius's Analects were required reading for the ministerial exams from ancient times all the way up until the exams were ended in the year 1905. How many governments that ruled China across that vast stretch of time truly conformed their rule to Confucian principles? It would be difficult to argue that the model Confucian ruler is anything other than the exception to the rule. And there's even a passage in the Analects that draws attention to this fact, showing that the stuffy old moralistic Confucians are not above poking fun at themselves. When a gatekeeper asks Confucius's disciple Tzu Lu where he comes from, he says, "I come from Confucius." When the gatekeeper hears that name, he says, quote, "Oh, is he the one who knows a thing cannot be done and still wants to do it?" End quote. One potential criticism of Confucius, then, is that what he purported to do, instruct men in the ways of virtue, was different from the actuality. Nevertheless, the Confucian rectification of names and the moral element within language that it reveals remains a useful and undervalued concept in philosophy. What would happen if we began to view language through this lens? That is, that every name we give something imposes a demand for propriety, that all things called by that name meet certain qualifications. At bottom, Confucius's rectification suggests a radical idea, that language does not simply convey a state of affairs. It establishes what the proper state of affairs ought to be. There is certainly a great opportunity within our modern philosophical theories of language to incorporate these ideas from the most influential philosopher in all of world history. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.